This is Tom Fox. Welcome to the newest edition in the Compliance Podcast Network, my latest podcast, Compliance and Coronavirus. As the voice of compliance, I wanted to start a podcast which will help bring both clarity and sanity to the field of compliance, the compliance practitioner, and indeed the compliance profession during this worldwide health and healthcare crisis. Taking up a variety of topics as diverse as working from home to sporting events, to the role of the board of directors, to crisis management, to the role of supply chains. We will look at all of these in this podcast. If you have a topic you'd like covered on compliance and coronavirus, please let me know. I'd be happy to do a podcast on it. Today I have with me Jesse Kaplan. He is the Managing Director of Corporate Oversight at Affiliated Monitors. He spent much of his career in the healthcare industry, and we talk about the challenges for healthcare providers, hospitals, and primary physicians in the era of COVID-19 and the attendant economic dislocation. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. And today I have with me Grandon. Rod is Managing Director at Affiliated Monitors, Inc., Managing Director of Monitoring Services. So, Rod, first of all, thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Tom, my pleasure. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Rod, you spent a large part of your professional career in the suspension and debarment world, and I wanted to maybe visit with you about some of the topics you're seeing and hearing from that industry and where that may go as we reopen the economy, particularly into Q3 and Q4 of this year. And so I wanted to ask, what kind of, as we are now in probably the month 3 of the coronavirus crisis, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges coming out as the country opens back up? Obviously, some states further along than others, but in terms of business reopenings.
So just as the same problem when we went into the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a tremendous flux in what was required. A lot of money went into the economy. Corporations responded by pursuing the money. But the risks changed day to day as employees were told to work remotely. Revenues dried up in many places. Challenges, all sorts of challenges that really stressed the workforce. And on top of that, you had a layer of uncertainty, corporate uncertainty and individual uncertainty. As we now transition through the response and we get a glimpse of opportunities to reopen, I think there's going to be a lot of the same challenges. The risks are going to be changing fairly dramatically. Some employees have been furloughed. Are they going to be brought back? It's creating more uncertainty as corporations respond to declining revenues over the past several months. I think we're going to see a very slow pickup in employment opportunities, work opportunities. Those left on the payroll are going to be struggling to do whatever they can to generate revenues. And as we've seen in past situations where there's tremendous stress on the corporate environment, it frequently leads to opportunities and incentives to engage in employee misconduct. So as we turn the corner and we get the opportunity to resume some degree of normalcy, frankly, there are going to be those left behind. There are those who think they're going to be left behind, and it is going to have a tremendous impact on both the culture within corporate organizations. And when I say the culture, I'm referring more specifically to the compliance culture within corporations. And it's going to affect, I think, employee behavior in a larger extent in terms of morale, in terms of trying to achieve objectives when, maybe those revenue targets of 2 quarters ago or even a quarter ago are just simply not realistic anymore. A lot of pressure to perform and opportunities to get to those marks are going to be very difficult, creating temptation.
Ron, I'm going to ask you a little bit about the kind of suspension and debarment world from both the private company and then government perspective. But I wanted to start with sort of the private business or the companies who do business with the government, whether they are traditional contractors who do work with the government on a regular basis, or companies who receive PPP or other government funding and perhaps are a little bit newer to receiving government funding. What sort of proactive steps would you suggest they take now to answer questions if a government regulator, a government hired monitor comes knocking?
I'm actually going to break the group. I'm going to break the corporate group into two. There are a lot of new entrants into the government marketplace over the last quarter. There were opportunities that companies, they saw the commercial side drying up, but they saw opportunities on the federal side, whether it's masks, personal protective equipment, a lot of opportunities to respond there. If they are not familiar with the rules associated with the federal marketplace, it can be a nightmare. They're just simple things that are basic in the federal contracting scheme that don't exist in the commercial world. A simple example: termination for convenience. Government can breach a contract. They have to pay costs incurred up to that point, but they can breach. You have to independently price what you are going to provide, your products and your services. There's a whole host of, anti-gratuity type provisions they have to comply with. Just a lot of little things that are normal, commonplace events in the commercial world. Your prospective customers, take them out for lunch. Your prospective customers, let's give them a little goodie bag or whatever. You transition into the federal world; those things are generally prohibited, and it can create a lot of roadblocks. So those companies really need, if they've entered into the federal marketplace, and certainly if they have an intent to stay in the federal marketplace, they got to learn the rules of the road. That's the number one compliance challenge with that set of companies. They got to understand what is in the Federal Acquisition Regulation and the various agency supplements. And then to compound this, in many, many, many cases, there are literally 100 or so clauses that are simply incorporated by reference. Clauses that still have compliance obligations, but it's not readily apparent what is required. They've got to dig behind the scenes. For those companies, the second set, for those companies who are already well-versed with the federal marketplace, they've got to deal, and frankly, this also applies to set A, but all of them have got to now comply with what is going on in terms of all this federal money that flooded the economy. A lot of rules came in to play. A lot of money came into play. And as that money entered into the marketplace, the government realized it didn't have a good set of rules to guide corporate behavior. So it, after the fact, started creating rules, and businesses had to respond, has had to respond. And that's usually not where you want to be, is in a reactive responding mode, particularly when the rules continue to bounce so quickly. So by way of example, some of the challenges, delays. Many federal contracts have been delayed under this notion of force majeure, which is just basically an act of God. A lot of companies are not familiar with what that means. And there's sort of this view that if you're delayed on a government project, you get compensated for that delay. If you've had your workforce idle, you get compensated for that. But in this case, it's not a government delay. And I think a lot of businesses either don't understand that or just now understanding that there's no cash cow waiting for this force majeure, this act of God. So they've got to be very careful in what they do. They're entitled to extended schedules for the period that they couldn't perform. There may be some money in there, but then they've got the added complexity of, well, what if you've already been compensated through the Paycheck Protection Program or some other federal source for your workforce, for your rent, for your utilities? You got to make sure you don't double dip. The federal government and the agencies, you read every day, you read in the paper or look at any press outlet, and they are looking for fraud. Oversight is the buzzword today. What is the oversight? Congressional oversight, agency oversight. Those companies, particularly those companies that work in the federal marketplace, are going to be under a microscope on how they've spent their money and how they've responded with the use of federal funds. And so companies have got to understand the rules, whether it's just basic FAR, but also how do you deal with these transitions, the use of federal funds. And as you start ramping up into some degree of normalcy, what if you don't use all that money? What do you do with it? How do you account for it? Are your controls in place to account for it? Just a tremendous number of challenges associated with this. But the bottom line is companies have to do the very best they can to understand the rules under which they're operating and which they have been operating the last couple of months. And they need to do their reasonable best to achieve compliance. And frankly, I would encourage companies to document their major decisions, to be very transparent in when they hit a decision point that has a touch of gray associated with it. They better document those so that they have a contemporaneous record that explains why they chose to spend or not spend particular funds. So again, understand the rules, document your decisions, and be ready for some strict oversight by federal authorities.
Rod, let me flip it over to the government side and maybe add an additional wrinkle, which is there's been some commentary in the compliance community about whether a monitor can actually perform its monitorship or monitor obligations during the time of coronavirus and travel restrictions, working from home, and kind of all of those things. Can the government use the monitor effectively, sort of going from now and forward into Q3 and 4?
So very interesting question, Tom. And in fact, a couple months ago, I was approached by a federal executive with that question. Can we, from the federal agency's perspective, from a suspending and debarring officials' perspective, monitoring in the context of an administrative agreement or a compliance agreement is one of the tools they had at their disposal. And the question was, the context was these agreements are only so if we can't exercise oversight. And me, a federal executive, in my rather limited budget and staffing, I don't have the capability of exercising that oversight. I need monitoring. Can monitoring be done during this COVID-19 response period when travel was in many cases prohibited, offices were closed, and we all basically resorted to remote tools? I thought it was a very fair question because, frankly, we saw the reports that were made by some saying you could not monitor effectively in this environment. Our experience is very different. We found that you could monitor effectively. We had to change some of our approaches. We had to think through it. But as a result of that conversation with the federal executive, I was invited to speak to what is known as the Interagency Suspension and Debarment Committee. It's a committee that consists of representatives from all the federal agencies' suspending and debarring offices. And I had the opportunity to explain to them that monitoring was still, depending where you are in your reopening, an effective tool. And that you had to make some adjustments, though. There are some basics associated with monitoring. One is understanding the client, understanding the problem, the challenges. Well, frankly, that can be done, and ensuring alignment between the government objectives and the corporation's objectives can be done using these remote meeting tools. It's no different than a face-to-face meeting. Interviews are another major portion of what we do to gain and gather information, which we use to form our observations and our reports. Again, remote tools, these remote conferencing tools are very effective. Frankly, I was very skeptical back in early March, but I've been very pleased in the quality of exchanges I've had using these video conferencing tools. So not much difference there. The document review, no changes whatsoever. That's always been, sort of a separate on the side that didn't require the face-to-face activity. The challenge was in focus groups. Focus groups are a wonderful tool where you gather essentially, or our practice anyway, you gather non-supervisory types. and you try to find out what's really going on the shop floor, what's really going on at the cooler in the office. What are people talking about? What is the buzz? What's the chatter? What's the morale like? That usually involves 8 to 12 people and a free exchange, a free and open exchange of ideas within that group discussion. Well, that you couldn't do, and still not doing. So we compensated by trying to get a larger sample of non-supervisory individuals into our interview pools. So instead of conducting a single focus group of 8 to 10 people, we reached out to try to collect a sample of, say, 15 to 20 people and get their non-supervisory views of what's going on. And again, outcome is, I think that's been just as effective as the information we gained through focus groups. So again, very impressed. And those were the messages that I delivered to the representatives at the Interagency Suspension Debarment Committee. My hope is they will get some confidence and continue to use this tool because it's a critical piece of their efforts.
Rod, you in a previous answer, you talked about how a company needed to think through, have a well thought out process for the utilization of government funds. And of course, my 3 favorite words: document, whatever they do. But are there some additional pieces of advice you might give a company as we move into the summer and perhaps even Q3 and 4 of 2020 that they should incorporate into their compliance program, whether they're under a monitorship or not?
So again, a lot of companies built their compliance programs based on the model that existed, say, at the end of fourth quarter of 2019 or before. My hope is that throughout the last several months, they have continued to work aggressively to identify risks and how they've changed. If their employees are working remotely for the first time, how are they exercising oversight? And they've asked questions, and they've worked with the supervisory chain. They've kept up the messaging. The challenge going forward as we play with this reopening or move to a new normal or a normal is to understand how the risks will continue to change. And companies need to be on top of that. And while they don't need to blow up what existed before in terms of their compliance program, be communicating more frequently with the workforce. Compliance officials need to work more closely with their stakeholders within the company and outside the company to make sure that expectations remain aligned in terms of what does the government expect? What does the leadership within the company expect? And then how do you transition that down to a set of compliance rules, guidelines, whatever you want to call them, for the workforce? As employees come back to work, some are going to come in, some are not. Is it going to create a us versus them attitude within the workforce? A new risk, a new challenge. Again, everything they do, they should be thinking about it from the perception of their workforce. What is this going to mean to the individual that works on the shop floor? What is this going to mean for the person on the loading dock? And they need to make sure that those individuals have enough information to help them make good decisions and to help the company perform without getting into a lot of gray areas and problems. And frankly, there are going to be a lot of gray area going forward, a lot of questions going forward. And the companies have got to be in a position to understand those challenges, to recognize the risks, and to keep the workforce reasonably informed on how to deal with these gray areas, and certainly how to raise questions, encouraging questions so it can be thought through, challenges can be thought through, and a reasonable outcome achieved.
Rod, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time, but I was wondering if our listeners wanted more information on your practice or Affiliated Monitors, where can they go?
Well, you can go to Affiliated Monitors website. We do have a host of independent writings on there. You can get that at www.affiliatedmonitors.com. Rather long, but again, www.affiliatedmonitors.com. And also, I would encourage companies to look, those who have received PPP funds, particularly smaller businesses, look at the SBA website. Use that to help guide and inform your decision making, and give yourself a chance to show that you behaved as reasonably as you can in such a dynamic environment.
Ron, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to visit with me. As we move to Q3 and perhaps Q4, I could call upon you again for some advice in whatever the normal is in those points in time.
Absolutely, Tom. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Compliance and Coronavirus. This podcast posts 3 times a week at 10 a.m. on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of each week. That's 10 a.m. Central Time. I hope you will check out our episodes as we post during this health crisis and economic dislocation. This month on The Compliance Life, I'm featuring Ryan Robillé, who talks about his journey to the CCO chair.